The night at Fort Meridian was the kind of silence only a military base could produce. Mechanical hums, distant footsteps, and the faint echo of orders carried by the wind. General Robert Hayes walked through the armory with a clipboard in hand, his polished boots clicking against the concrete floor. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, painting the steel shelves and weapon racks in pale shades of gray. It was supposed to be a routine inspection. Nothing more. But as he turned the corner near the far end of the storage wing, his eyes caught something that broke the monotony. A lone figure sat in the corner, head bowed, hands steady, tending to a massive Barrett rifle laid across a maintenance table. The man moved with an almost ritual precision, every motion deliberate, almost silent, as though each screw, each wipe of the cloth, carried meaning. General Hayes stopped. He was a man who had seen hundreds of soldiers handle firearms, but this was different. The discipline was surgical. The stillness, unnerving. The soldier didn't notice him at first, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. "Sergeant," Hayes called out, his tone firm but calm. The man looked up, his gray eyes sharp beneath the dim light. "Evening, sir." The nameplate read Miller. But below it, Hayes noticed something else, a small rectangular badge on his chest. The letters etched in black steel made the general's heartbeat skip. It read, 2,500 yard confirmed neutralization. Hayes froze. That wasn't possible. Or at least, not something one just stumbled upon. The longest verified shot on record was nowhere near that mark. Either the badge was a fabrication, or the man wearing it had done something history hadn't yet learned about. "What's your unit, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, taking a step closer. "Reconnaissance support, sir," Miller replied. His voice was calm, too calm. "Attached to several joint operations teams. Classified." "Classified." Hayes repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You're a staff sergeant, not a ghost." The corner of Miller's mouth lifted just slightly. "Some people call me that too, sir." Hayes studied him for a moment. The rifle on the table wasn't a standard Barrett. It had modifications: custom barrel, carbon fiber bipod, a high-definition scope with layered filters, and a laser rangefinder synchronized to an external module. The setup looked like something between military engineering and experimental science. "Tell me about that badge," Hayes said finally. Miller didn't look away. "It's not for decoration, sir. It's a record. One shot, 2,500 yards. Confirmed." Hayes felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Under whose authorization?" "Task Force Orion," Miller said. "Mission files not open access." That name, Orion, was one Hayes had only heard whispered in restricted briefings. A shadow task force, answerable only to select branches within the Defense Command. He exhaled, trying to mask his curiosity with authority. "Explain how that's even possible." Miller set down the cleaning rod, wiping his hands with a cloth. "With respect, sir, it's a long explanation. It involves math, weather physics, and a bit of patience." "I have time," Hayes replied. "Then you'll need more than that," Miller said quietly. The general frowned. The sergeant wasn't being insubordinate. He was being factual. There was a confidence there, a quiet power, that made Hayes both intrigued and cautious. He watched as Miller began reassembling the weapon, each piece sliding into place with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The steel glinted faintly in the light, a reflection of something methodical, almost meditative. Hayes circled the table slowly. "Where did you learn that kind of shot?" "Not from a manual, sir." "Then where?" Miller hesitated before answering. "Mountains. Cold air. Silence. The kind of place where a mistake doesn't get a second chance." Hayes studied him again. This wasn't arrogance. This was precision personified. A soldier molded by conditions no training camp could replicate. He nodded once, then said, "Tomorrow morning, I want a demonstration. You say you can hit targets at impossible distances. Let's see what that looks like under controlled conditions." "Yes, sir." As Hayes turned to leave, he glanced one last time at the weapon resting under the dim light. The long barrel gleamed like a blade. The name Ghost Miller echoed in his head, and for the first time that night, the general's routine inspection no longer felt routine. Outside, the wind swept through the base, carrying sand and cold air across the concrete. The stars above Fort Meridian were sharp and clear, as though the sky itself were watching. In one of the armory's many shadows, the soldier known as Ghost sat silently, the faint metallic click of a bolt echoing in the dark. He wasn't just maintaining a weapon. He was preparing for something. Something that might soon demand the kind of shot no one else could take. And deep down, General Hayes knew, whatever truth lay behind that badge, it would change the way he understood warfare forever. The morning came with a chill that clung to the steel walls of Fort Meridian. The sun had barely risen, and the air carried a haze of dust stirred up by the early patrols. General Hayes stood by the long firing range that stretched across the desert terrain, hands behind his back, waiting. The test he demanded last night was about to begin. Harper Miller appeared at precisely 600 hours, his uniform pressed, his demeanor as calm as the night before. The Barrett rifle rested across his shoulder like a silent companion. A small case followed behind him, attached to a mobile stand with cables, screens, and sensors. It wasn't military standard. It looked like something built from pieces of several different systems, field tech fused with scientific precision. Hayes glanced at it. "That's not issued equipment." "No, sir," Miller replied. "Custom-built. Calibrated for environmental variance and long-range correction." The general raised an eyebrow. "You built it yourself?" "Partly. The rest came from engineers who think too much and talk too little." Hayes gave a faint smirk. "You sound like one of them." Miller didn't answer. Instead, he crouched beside the tripod and began setting up a small network of wind sensors across the sand. Each one emitted a soft pulse of light as it linked to the main console. A digital feed came alive, streaming data about temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind vectors at various elevations. Hayes leaned forward slightly. "You can read all that?" "Yes, sir. But reading isn't the hard part. It's knowing when not to trust the numbers." The general frowned. "Explain." "Wind doesn't behave like a line. It bends. It twists. A bullet fired at over 2,000 yards doesn't travel through one condition. It crosses a dozen. Temperature gradients shift. Density changes. Even the rotation of the Earth pulls it off course." Miller lifted the rifle, his movements fluid, reverent almost. He spoke as he worked, attaching the scope, adjusting the angle, checking the rangefinder alignment. At long distances, every law of physics becomes an adversary. The bullet fights gravity, drag, spin drift, and the Coriolis effect. I can't stop any of them, I can only predict their conversation. Hayes watched in silence. The man's tone wasn't arrogant. It was analytical, almost detached. "So how did you confirm that shot? The one on your badge?" Hayes asked. Miller paused, hands tightening on the bipod. "It took me 5 hours to prepare, sir. We were stationed in a mountain valley. Thin air. Temperatures dropped below freezing. The target was a hostile lookout positioned across the ridge, 2,500 yards away." Hayes blinked slowly. "That's almost 1.5 miles." "Yes, sir. Which means I had to read the wind at every layer between us." He tapped the monitor. The display split into multiple elevation bands, each showing wind speed and direction at different altitudes. I used a combination of sensors, visual cues, and thermal shimmer readings. Each layer changed the trajectory. A 2-degree shift could move the impact point by a foot. "Sounds impossible," Hayes muttered. "It would be if you rushed," Miller said softly. "But I didn't. I waited until every variable aligned, the light, the wind, the pressure. It took hours. When I pulled the trigger, it wasn't guessing. It was knowing." Hayes crossed his arms. "Knowing what?" "That there wouldn't be a second chance." For a moment, neither man spoke. The desert wind swept across the range, carrying the scent of dust and fuel. The hum of the bass seemed to fade. Hayes finally gestured toward the target station 800 yards away. "Show me." Miller nodded once. He adjusted his ear protection, loaded a single .50 caliber round into the chamber, and took position prone against the mat. The barrel of the Barrett extended past the firing line, aimed toward the distant steel target that shimmered faintly in the morning light. He exhaled slowly. His world narrowed to the scope's crosshairs. Hayes could see the shift, the way Miller's breathing changed, the stillness that overtook his body, the eerie absence of hesitation. A moment later, a thunderous crack tore through the air. The shockwave rolled across the desert, echoing off the far walls. A heartbeat later, the steel target rang with a sharp sound of impact. The general's binoculars confirmed it. The bullet had struck almost dead center. Barely an inch off perfect alignment. Hayes lowered the glasses. "That's remarkable." Miller stood, ejecting the empty casing with practiced ease. 800 yards isn't much of a test, sir. But it's all we have here. Hayes stepped forward, inspecting the console once more. The readings were meticulous, calculated down to decimals. "You're not just a marksman," he said finally. "You're an engineer, a physicist, and a gambler rolled into one." Miller gave a faint smile. "A gambler assumes luck plays a part, sir. I don't." Hayes looked back toward the distant target, then to the man beside him. There was something haunting about his composure, a kind of intelligence tempered by solitude. "I'll want to see your file, Sergeant," Hayes said, breaking the silence. "All of it?" "Yes, sir. But you'll need clearance." Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Then I'll get it." As the general walked away, Miller watched the horizon, his gaze steady, unreadable. The shot still echoed faintly in the dry air, not as noise, but as proof. Proof that sometimes the impossible wasn't about breaking limits. It was about understanding them so completely that they stopped being limits at all. Behind him, the sensors continued to blink softly, gathering data that no one else on the base could interpret. The soldier known as Ghost dismantled his rifle piece by piece, methodical as ever, each movement a whisper of discipline. And somewhere inside that precision, Hayes realized, lay the kind of power the military could never fully control. The desert sun climbed high above Fort Meridian, casting long, sharp shadows across the range. The wind was calmer now, though the air shimmered with heat waves that distorted the horizon. General Hayes returned to the range hours later, flanked by 2 officers from the ballistics department and a small camera crew assigned to document the demonstration for internal review. Miller was already there. He had reconstructed his setup, the Barrett .50, the sensors, the tablet-sized console that tracked environmental changes in real time. But now there were additional components, a set of small optical drones hovering 50 feet above the range, feeding telemetry back to his system. Hayes frowned slightly. "You added more equipment." "Yes, sir," Miller replied without looking up. "If we're recording this, I need precision data to validate the results. Every variable should be logged." The general nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But remember, this isn't a classified operation. Keep it simple." Miller glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Simplicity is the product of complexity, sir. I'll keep it understandable." The officers nearby exchanged uncertain looks. One of them, Captain Linford, leaned toward Hayes. "General, with respect, that man's system looks like a science experiment, not a firing test." Hayes didn't respond. He wanted to see where this would lead. "Let him work," he said quietly. The preparation took nearly an hour. Miller moved in deliberate silence, every motion exact. He adjusted the scope, checked the barrel temperature, recalibrated for the rising heat. The air density had shifted since morning, thinner now, meaning the bullet would travel slightly farther before gravity pulled it down. Finally, he spoke. "Target is 800 yards, right?" "Yes," Hayes confirmed. Miller nodded. "Elevation at 0.8 degrees. Wind from 2 o'clock, at 4 knots. Temperature 86. Humidity low. Range correction plus +0.6 mil." He chambered a single round, the heavy click echoing through the range. "Firing on your mark." Hayes gave a short nod. "Fire." The sound that followed was thunder. The recoil jolted through the ground, and the observers flinched instinctively. The target far ahead trembled, a dull metallic clang reaching them a heartbeat later. Through binoculars, Hayes saw the impact, a near-perfect shot, barely off-center. The officer beside him muttered something under his breath. The data feed on Miller's screen confirmed it, deviation of less than an inch. "Good shot," Hayes said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "But that's still 800 yards. You claim 2,500. Miller reloaded calmly. "The physics doesn't change, sir. Just the patience." Captain Linford scoffed. 5 hours of waiting? That's not combat efficiency. That's insanity. Miller's eyes lifted, steady and cold. If one bullet ends a situation that would cost 12 men their lives, is that insanity? The range fell silent. Even Hayes didn't answer immediately. Miller continued, his tone low but firm. The world thinks of snipers as shooters. That's the mistake. We're readers. We read wind like language, time like music, and distance like emotion. Every variable speaks, and I listen. He placed the rifle down gently, resting his hand on the scope. When the environment is in conflict, you wait until it agrees with you. That's when the shot becomes truth. Hayes studied him. The words were poetic, but beneath them was a sharpness, the kind of understanding that couldn't be trained through manuals. He turned toward the camera team. "Shut the recording down," he ordered. "That's enough for today." Miller didn't protest. He began disassembling the weapon again, methodical as before. Each motion had rhythm, each sound deliberate. Hayes walked closer. "Tell me something, Sergeant. That 2,500-yard shot, was it a sanctioned engagement?" Miller paused. "It was necessary." "That's not what I asked." His gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes, sir, the line between sanctioned and necessary depends on who's holding the scope." Hayes exhaled slowly. "You're treading dangerous ground, Sergeant." "I already did, sir," Miller replied quietly. "That's how the shot happened." The general didn't respond. He could feel his pulse quickening, not from anger but from the realization that this man operated under a logic entirely his own, disciplined, but untethered from bureaucracy. When the cleanup was finished, Hayes dismissed the others and walked alone back to the armory. His thoughts churned. If Miller truly had accomplished what his badge claimed, it meant he operated under a level of autonomy the military couldn't easily contain. A man like that could be either a weapon or a liability, depending on who gave the order. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the range was empty again. Miller stood alone, staring across the desert, the wind tugging at his uniform. The echo of his earlier shot still hung faintly in the air, fading slowly into silence. He picked up the spent casing from the sand, rolled it between his fingers, and slipped it into his pocket. Every bullet had a story. This one, he thought, had just begun to be told. Night fell heavy over Fort Meridian. The desert cooled fast after sunset, and the dry air seemed to draw the sound out of everything. Even the crickets were silent. General Hayes sat alone in his office, the light from his desk lamp spilling across stacks of reports and encrypted drives. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room as he stared at one file name on his secure terminal, Miller Harper J. Clearance restricted. He had requested access hours ago, invoking an old operational override that few generals dared use. The system had hesitated, warning him that this particular file fell under a higher clearance tier. But Hayes had pressed on. If the man standing in his base was operating outside the regular chain of command, then he needed to know why. The screen flickered. A moment later, the classified file opened, and what he saw forced him to sit back in his chair. The first pages were blacked out almost entirely, filled with redacted lines and code numbers that led nowhere. But then came a section labeled Operational Record, Task Force Orion. Below that, his eyes scanned through mission logs and terse after-action reports. There were entries dated years apart, each marked Confirmed, Level 7. Operation, Silent Reach. Location, Kashmir Ridge Complex. Objective, Hostage Extraction. Asset, SSGT. Harper Miller, Precision Recon Support. Hayes frowned and scrolled. There were coordinates, weather conditions, and something that looked like a pre-strike assessment report. Then a fragment of text stopped him cold. Primary approach blocked by fortified lookout. Distance to target, 2,506 yards. Wind variable, cross speed 5 knots, updraft unstable. Target neutralized with single round. Window, 4:17 local time. Hostage extraction successful. 0 friendly casualties. He stared at the words for several seconds. The impossible badge suddenly had context. It wasn't a boast. It was a record, one logged, verified, and buried in a vault of classified data. A faint knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," Hayes said, his voice low. A junior officer stepped in and saluted. "Sir, Sergeant Miller is outside." He said you wanted to see him. Hayes closed the file and minimized the screen. Send him in. Moments later, Miller entered the room. The overhead light caught the edges of his uniform, neat as always. He didn't look tired, though Hayes could tell he hadn't slept. Sit down, Sergeant. Miller obeyed without a word. The silence between them stretched until Hayes finally said, I read your file. The sergeant's expression didn't change. I expected you would, sir. Task Force Orion. Hostage extraction in Kashmir Ridge. That's your 2,500-yard shot, isn't it? Yes, sir. Hayes leaned forward. You realize that file is sealed above my clearance level? That you shouldn't even be on this base without a handler? Miller nodded slowly. Permission was granted for temporary assignment. Observation duty, maintenance, and system calibration. Observation of what? Miller hesitated before replying. Of me, sir. Hayes frowned. Explain that. After Kashmir, Command wanted to assess long-term operational viability. They didn't say it out loud, but they wanted to know if I broke. Hayes studied him, his voice quiet. Did you? Miller's eyes flickered, not with emotion, but memory. When you wait 5 hours for one shot, sir, you learn that stillness doesn't leave easily. Even when the mission ends, it stays. The general sat back. The man across from him wasn't unhinged. He wasn't arrogant or reckless. He was something rarer, someone who had looked into the mathematics of death and seen it as a function, not an act. Hayes rubbed his temple. That kind of discipline, it's valuable, but it's also dangerous. I don't choose where they send me, Miller replied. I just make sure the numbers end where they're supposed to. You're not a machine, Sergeant. No, sir. But the bullet is. My job is to understand it. The words lingered in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. Hayes turned his chair slightly, staring at the window where the desert moon hung low and pale. Why didn't they tell me? Miller didn't answer. Instead, he said softly, sometimes the fewer people who know, the safer everyone else is. The general exhaled, his mind racing through possibilities. What kind of operations used soldiers like this? Who gave the orders? And more importantly, what else was Miller capable of that hadn't been recorded? He looked back toward the sergeant. If Command wanted to test your stability, I'd say they've succeeded. You're as calm as a statue. Miller's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. Still water hides deep currents, sir. Hayes nodded slowly, realizing how true that was. He closed the folder on his desk. You're dismissed, Sergeant. But stay ready. Something tells me this assignment isn't over. Miller stood, saluted, and left without a word. When the door shut, Hayes opened the file one more time. At the bottom of the page was a line he hadn't noticed before. Subject Miller classified as strategic asset. Further deployment contingent upon crisis-level approval. Note, use only when conventional parameters fail. He sat back, the words burning into his mind. Use only when conventional parameters fail. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, whispering against the window. Somewhere in the armory, Harper Ghost Miller was already back at his corner, cleaning his rifle under the dim light, the same way he had when Hayes first found him. And though the general couldn't see him, he could almost feel it. The sense that every motion, every breath, was preparation for something neither of them fully understood yet. The next morning dawned in muted gold. The horizon of Fort Meridian shimmered under the desert sun, and the air carried that familiar silence before something shifts, the kind of silence soldiers learn to feel in their bones. General Hayes walked across the base with his usual authority, but his mind was anything but calm. The night's revelation still replayed in his thoughts. The redacted file, the phrase strategic asset, and the haunting steadiness of Staff Sergeant Harper Ghost Miller. When Hayes stepped into the command hall, 2 intelligence officers were already waiting. One of them, a civilian analyst from Defense Research, held a sealed folder marked Directive 9C, Immediate Action. Hayes took it, broke the seal, and scanned the contents. His jaw tightened. It was an operational request. An extraction mission. And the asset named for deployment was none other than Miller. The target zone was deep in the mountains along the Nevada testing corridor, an area still used for covert exercises but currently compromised by an unknown hostile presence. Communications with an engineering outpost had gone silent 48 hours earlier. Drones sent for surveillance hadn't returned. The order was clear: secure the facility, recover the personnel, neutralize threats. Hayes read the last line twice. Recommend deployment of precision recon specialist, Ghost Miller. He exhaled slowly, closing the folder. The pattern was too familiar: another impossible mission in open terrain, another classified scenario buried under acronyms and sealed files. Yet this time, it wasn't under Task Force Orion. This one bore his own signature line, waiting for approval. Within an hour, he found Miller at the range. The sergeant was in his usual place, checking optics under the morning sun. "Sergeant Miller," Hayes said, approaching. "Sir. We have a situation. Classified. Mountain coordinates, long-range potential hostiles. Command recommends you as the lead marksman." Miller didn't blink. "When do we leave?" "That depends," Hayes replied, studying him carefully. "Do you think you're ready?" Miller's gaze met his. "Preparation is constant, sir. Readiness is just timing." Hayes handed him the folder. "Then read this and tell me if you see what I see." Miller took the document, his eyes scanning every line. The subtle shift in his posture told Hayes what he needed to know. "This isn't a routine mission," Miller said finally. "No," Hayes agreed. "And that's exactly why they called for you." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the desert wind weaving between them. Then Hayes spoke again, his tone low. "You realize they're testing you again, don't you? Testing how far the system can bend around a man who doesn't break." Miller gave a faint nod. "Then let them test, sir. The numbers don't lie." By evening, a small convoy rolled out of Fort Meridian, 2 transport vehicles, a support truck, and a satellite-link truck trailing behind. Hayes rode in the command vehicle while Miller sat in the rear, his Barrett secured beside him. The drive stretched for hours through twisting desert roads that bled into the mountain passes. When they reached the designated ridge, the sun had fallen, and the night was alive with wind. The outpost below was dark, no lights, no signals. Hayes peered through night optics, scanning for heat signatures. "Nothing," he muttered. "No movement." Miller was already unpacking equipment: rangefinder, sensors, ballistic computer. The same methodical rhythm as always, only this time sharper, faster. He pointed toward a cliff face across the ravine. "There," he said. "Heat fluctuation. Roof vent thermal bleed." Hayes adjusted his optics. "You're sure?" "Positive. Someone's down there." Within minutes, the range feed synced. The wind patterns across the ravine were erratic, bouncing between the cliffs. Miller adjusted for it, his face lit faintly by the glow of the console. The numbers flowed like music: altitude corrections, humidity, drag coefficients, angular drift. "Target window?" Hayes asked. 60 seconds, if the wind holds." He lay prone, scope trained on the faint outline of the structure below. His breathing slowed, pulse steady, the world narrowing to the glass circle before him. Time became elastic, stretching, thinning, until all that existed was motion and silence. Then, without hesitation, he exhaled. The rifle roared. The muzzle flash lit the ridge for an instant, and the recoil echoed through the mountains. Seconds later, a bright spark erupted on the opposing cliff, the vent he had aimed for shattered, flames bursting outward. Then came the sound, a deep concussive boom that rolled across the valley. Hayes looked through his binoculars, his voice tight. "What was that?" "Fuel cache," Miller replied calmly. "Overpressure detonated secondary. Hostiles eliminated." "How did you know?" "The numbers told me, sir." The general didn't answer. Down in the valley, the outpost lights flickered weakly to life, emergency systems kicking in. The engineers had survived, trapped but unharmed. Rescue teams would arrive within the hour. Hayes lowered his binoculars, staring at Miller, who was already disassembling the rifle with the same eerie calm as before. "You realize what you just did will never make a report," Hayes said quietly. Miller looked at him, eyes unreadable. "Most things that matter don't." For a moment, the wind stilled. Only the sound of cooling metal filled the air. Hayes realized something then. This man didn't need orders, recognition, or medals. He functioned on something deeper: precision as purpose, silence as discipline. As they descended the ridge under a pale moon, Hayes watched him walk ahead, silhouette framed against the glowing desert. Ghost Miller, the soldier no one quite owned, the secret that could end wars quietly. Back at Fort Meridian, when the convoy returned at dawn, Miller went straight to the armory. Same corner. Same ritual. He cleaned the barret with patient hands, each motion reflecting an unspoken truth. War, he knew, was not about noise. It was about silence, the silence between breath and trigger, between chaos and control. And in that silence, he found his order. General Hayes paused at the doorway, watching him for a long moment before turning away. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. Some things, he realized, were better left in the quiet, where they belonged. Outside, the morning sun broke over Fort Meridian, washing the desert in gold. Inside, in a corner of the armory, the faint metallic sound of a rifle bolt sliding home echoed softly, a reminder that somewhere beneath the calm waited the fire.